The table they put me at had a leaf print paper runner and 4 booster seats stacked in the corner. My nephew Eli, who is 7, was on my left. He was working on a word search and eating the bread basket one piece at a time with the focus of a man who has important priorities. On my right, my niece Cora, who is 4, had already knocked over her apple juice and was trying to pretend she hadn't. Across from me sat my cousin Danny's twins, both 5, both named after weather phenomena for reasons nobody in the family has ever satisfactorily explained. I was 34 years old. I was at the children's table. The adults were at the long table in the back of the dining room, 8 of them, my mother and father and brother and his wife and the various assembled relatives who had raided a chair. The long table had cloth napkins and the good candles and the bread basket, the other bread basket, the one with the rosemary focaccia. I could see it from where I was sitting. I want to tell you 2 things. The first is that I did not say anything. I took my seat and I unfolded the paper napkin, and I helped Cora with her apple juice situation, and I ate my dinner, and I was polite to everyone at my table. And the children were actually excellent company, in the way that children sometimes are when adults have stopped performing for each other and are just trying to get through the meal. The second thing is this: I own the restaurant. What Calvin Marsh said when he crossed the dining room and stood at the edge of my table and asked, in a voice that carried to every corner of that room, I'll tell you exactly what he said. But first I need you to understand what the room was, and how it came to belong to me, and what it cost, and why none of the 8 adults at the long table thought to wonder. Stay with me. Because what none of them saw coming that night happened 14 steps away, at a table set for grown-ups, without a word raised in anger. Welcome back. This is a place for quiet stories about ordinary people and the moments that settle everything that's been unsettled for far too long. If you have ever been assigned a smaller seat than the one you earned, this one is for you. I'll be right back at that table. First, let me tell you how I got there. Not the children's table, the restaurant. Drop a comment and subscribe. We're going back 6 years. My name is Nora Delacroix, and I grew up in Dunmore, Ohio, in a family where the organizing principle was legibility. By which I mean, what you did for a living had to be something you could explain at a dinner party in under 30 seconds, with a clean noun, and it had to be something that sounded like enough. My father managed a regional insurance office. My mother did something in HR that she described with a single confident word, consulting, that satisfied most questions. My brother Brandon sold commercial real estate, which gave him the noun and the income and the particular social confidence of a man whose job fits cleanly into a sentence. I cooked. Not in the tidy, explainable way of someone who has a restaurant on a busy street with a Yelp page and a sign. I cooked in the way I had been cooking since I was 12, which was obsessively, privately, experimentally, in a way that required no audience and satisfied a hunger I couldn't fully name. I worked my way through commercial kitchens the same way some people work their way through graduate programs, not in a straight line toward a credential, but in the specific, absorbing way of someone who is learning a language and won't stop until they can dream in it. I was a line cook at 22 in Columbus. Sous chef at a farm-to-table place in Athens at 26, which is where I learned what food could be when it was honest about where it came from. Head chef at a small hotel restaurant back in Dunmore at 28, which is where I stayed, quietly and competently, while I saved money and made a plan. The plan took 6 years. I did not tell anyone in my family about the plan. This is the part I need to explain carefully, because the reasonable question is why not, and the answer is not simple. It is not that I was afraid of their opinions. It is not that I didn't trust them with information. It is that I had spent my adult life watching my family receive my choices with a particular quality of mild disappointment that they had perfected into something almost like support. They were never actively discouraging. They were tepidly encouraging in the specific way of people who have already decided what the outcome will be and are too polite to say so. When I took the line cook job at 22, my mother said, "That's a hard life, Nora. I hope you know what you're getting into." When I made sous chef, she said, "Good for you. Are you sure you don't want to go back to school?" When I became head chef at 28, my father said, "That's steady at least," with the faint relief of a man reassured that his daughter is not going to ask him for money. Brandon said I was good at cooking, which I understood was meant as a compliment, and landed as something else entirely. I stopped telling them about the milestones. Not dramatically, I didn't announce a policy of silence. I just let the information get smaller. I showed up at dinners and answered questions about work with enough to satisfy, and not enough to invite the particular quality of their attention I had learned was not useful to me. That was my mistake, in some ways. And in other ways, it was the smartest thing I ever did. The plan, in its simplest form, was this: find a space in Dunmore that had the bones for what I wanted, secure financing, and open a restaurant that did what I believed a restaurant in a town like Dunmore should do: honest food, local sourcing, a room that felt like it belonged here rather than like it was trying to be somewhere else. 14 tables. Seasonal menu. No reservations for the bar. The bones I found were a former diner on Maple Street that had been closed for 3 years after its owner, Ruth Alderman, retired. Ruth had run it for 32 years. She was 63 when she retired and 67 when I found her, through a mutual acquaintance, in a small house outside town where she had immediately begun going quietly insane from inactivity. She was, and I say this as someone who has worked for difficult people and easy ones and knows the difference, the best person I have ever learned anything from. Ruth Alderman did not mentor me in the formal way of someone who has decided to impart wisdom. She mentored me the way experienced people sometimes do, by treating you as a capable adult who can be told the truth, and telling you the truth, and expecting you to do something with it. She told me what she had done right in 32 years, and she told me the 2 things she had done wrong, and she told me which was which and why. She sold me the building on a seller-financed agreement that she structured specifically to make it survivable for me, with a payment schedule that accounted for the fact that restaurants don't make money in the first 18 months, and sometimes not in the first 3 years. I secured an SBA loan for the renovation and equipment. $240,000, my name on the papers, my liability, my bet on myself. Ruth said when we signed that she had been waiting for someone to do something real with that building. She said it without drama. She said it the way she said everything as a fact, something she had noted and was reporting. I said I would try not to disappoint her. She said, "You won't. I've watched you work. You disappoint people who don't pay attention, Nora. The ones who look are never disappointed." I wrote that down on a recipe card, the same kind she had used for 32 years, cream-colored stock with a small blue border. That card is framed in the entryway of Sycamore now, next to the specials board, where every person who walks in sees it first before they see anything else. I named the restaurant Sycamore. For the tree that grows in difficult soil and lives for 200 years anyway. We opened in March. I want to tell you what the 6 years before March looked like, because the opening is the visible part, and the 6 years is the part that actually explains everything. I worked 2 jobs from 28 to 31 to save the down payment and the operating reserve, the hotel restaurant during the day and a catering company on weekends. I did not take vacations. I lived in an apartment so small that my sous chef jokes, now, that I must have kept my knife rolls in the bathroom. I kept my knife rolls in the bathroom. I did the business plan myself, 3 drafts over 2 years, until the numbers were ones I could defend from any angle to any lender. I took a course in small business finance on weekday evenings, sitting in a classroom that smelled like carpet cleaner and fluorescent light, because I understood that opening a restaurant was not only a cooking problem. I took a food safety certification course, and then I took the manager-level version. I read every article I could find about restaurant economics, and I visited every independently owned restaurant within 60 miles that had been open more than 5 years, and I asked their owners, politely and directly, what had nearly destroyed them and what had kept them. People are remarkably honest about their near disasters when you ask with genuine interest and no agenda. I met with Ruth once a week in the first year we knew each other, at her house or at the Maple Street building, which she had kept in decent repair and which still smelled, faintly and indelibly, like the diner it had been coffee and cast iron and the specific sweetness of old linoleum. I came with a notebook and she talked and I wrote things down. Not recipes at first. The business of it. She told me, your margin on food cost cannot exceed 30% or the math stops working before it starts. She told me, your first hire is the most important hire you ever make, and if you rush it, you will spend a year undoing it. She told me about the first 5 years of her own diner, the years that were genuinely uncertain, when she had considered selling twice, and had not because she had nowhere else to go and nothing she would rather be doing. She said, every good restaurant gets built in the years when nobody's watching. The watching comes later. I asked her once why she had structured the seller financing the way she did, on terms that clearly favored me. She said, because I want this to work, and I've done enough math to know that a payment structure that breaks you in year one doesn't serve either of us. She paused. And because you remind me of myself, and I wanted someone to do what I would have done with 30 more years. I did not know what to say. I said thank you. She said, don't thank me. Open a good restaurant. The building took 8 months to renovate. I did the project management myself, alongside the catering work and the hotel, staying on budget by being personally present for every decision that could go wrong. The plumbing cost $11,000 more than the estimate, which I handled by extending the catering work another 3 months and giving up dinners out for a season. The dining room floor had to be refinished twice before I was satisfied with it. I spent 2 weeks alone in the building in October, the year before we opened, with a sander and a reference photograph, and the patience of a woman who had learned, through years of cooking, that some things cannot be rushed without becoming something worse. Ruth stopped by once during those weeks. She stood in the doorway and looked at the floor and said, good. One word. I received it like a standing ovation. The near disaster for Sycamore came 2 weeks before opening, on a Thursday afternoon in February, when the county health inspector arrived for a pre-opening inspection and cited us for a ventilation issue in the prep kitchen that was going to require a specific part from a supplier in Columbus who had a 14-day lead time. I sat in the empty dining room after the inspector left, and I looked at the 14 tables I had chosen one by one, the chairs that had taken me 3 weeks to find, the framed recipe card in the entryway, and I thought, this does not close. I will not let this close. I drove to Columbus that night. I found the supplier. I paid the expedite fee out of money I did not have to spare. I drove back with the part at 2 a.m. I had it installed by a licensed contractor by Friday morning, re-inspected by Monday, approved by Wednesday. 6 days. We opened on schedule. I did not tell my family any of this because I had not told my family about Sycamore. This was still, as of that February, something I was doing in the space my family had decided was empty. The first 3 Thanksgivings I was building Sycamore, the planning years, the saving years, my mother called in mid-October to say the family was doing something small and casual, and I probably wouldn't want to bother traveling, since the drive was 40 minutes and I was always so busy. I said I understood. She said she would miss me. She said it with the warmth she was capable of, and I believed her and I did not push. The first year, I spent Thanksgiving at work. The catering company had a corporate client who had hired us for a private dinner, and I needed the money, and the schedule suited me fine. I ate leftover turkey at 11 p.m. in the kitchen of a building in Dunmore that would become Sycamore 2 years later, and I felt, if not joyful, then entirely purposeful. That is sometimes the better thing. The second year, I was invited to a Friendsgiving organized by Marcus, my sous chef, and his partner. There were 7 of us around a folding table covered with a tablecloth, and we cooked together and everyone brought something and nobody sat at a children's table, and nobody orchestrated the occasion to prove anything about anyone. It was the best Thanksgiving I had had in years, and I told Marcus so. He said, your mother's a piece of work, Nora. I said, she's doing her best with what she has. He looked at me. He said, you're very generous. I said, no, I'm just precise. The third year was the one I learned about from Brandon. Not the disinvitation itself, that was delivered, as usual, by my mother in October. But about 3 weeks after the call, Brandon mentioned, without context, that Thanksgiving at Aunt Carol's had been fun, that the cousins had all come, that it had been a good group. He said it the way you say things when you are thinking about something else entirely and not monitoring your own mouth. I said, "Oh, I didn't realize that was happening." Brandon said, "Yeah, Mom wasn't sure you'd want to come. You know how she gets about planning around your schedule." My schedule? The schedule of a woman who was working 70-hour weeks to build the only thing she had ever wanted to build, and who had apparently been scheduled around and out of Thanksgiving for 3 consecutive years. I said, I would have come. Brandon said, The way Brandon says things when he doesn't want to carry the weight of them. I hung up and I opened the Sycamore calendar on my laptop, and I scheduled Thanksgiving as a closed day, for the first time so that I could be available if invited. Then I called my mother and said I was coming to Thanksgiving and asked where it was. She sounded surprised. She said it was at the restaurant on Millbrook Road. Brandon had made the reservation, didn't I know? She said this in the way she had of not apologizing for things, by implying that the missing information was a failure of my attention rather than her communication. She said, "We'll have a big group. It'll be fun." I said, "Great." She had not yet told me there was a seating plan. If you've ever been handed a smaller seat than the one you earned and smiled through the whole meal anyway, leave one word below. I read every single comment. And subscribe, because the part where the room finds out is coming, and I want you to be here for it. Sycamore was 8 months old when Thanksgiving arrived. I had not told my family it existed. I had not told anyone in my family my middle name if it wasn't relevant, which sounds like an exaggeration, but is the logical conclusion of years of watching the information I shared become the material for the mild disappointment performance. I had, however, told Ruth. Ruth knew everything because Ruth was the person whose opinion I cared about most, and because she had a financial stake in my success, and therefore a claim on accurate information. Ruth had come to the soft opening in March and sat at table 6 and eaten the seared duck with sorghum and spring onion and said, "You didn't disappoint me," which was the best review Sycamore ever received and the only one I put on the wall. Ruth also knew Calvin Marsh, the food writer from the Columbus paper who had been trying to identify the owner of Sycamore since April. Sycamore had a no-press policy in its first year, my policy, deliberate, because I wanted to work out the problems in private before I invited public attention. I had not agreed to any interviews. I had not provided my name to any publication. The staff had been instructed, politely, to decline comment on ownership. The Dunmore restaurant scene is small enough that most people assumed Sycamore was a Columbus project with a Dunmore outpost, and I had not corrected this impression. Calvin Marsh had eaten at Sycamore 3 times. I knew this because he had used his real name on the reservation and I recognized it. He was good about it. He hadn't pressed the staff, hadn't made a thing of it. He just kept coming back and eating and writing about the food in terms that were, from what I could tell, accurate and respectful. He called the cranberry conserve, a thing I will think about for years, which was Ruth's recipe adapted, and which I was glad he appreciated. He called Ruth in October. He told her he was planning to be in Dunmore for a piece on independent Thanksgiving menus, and he was hoping to finally get a conversation with the Sycamore owner. Ruth told him she would pass the message along. Ruth called me the same day. She said, "His timing is impeccable, Nora." And she said it with the specific quality of amusement she got when things aligned in a way she had been quietly arranging for. I said, "What does that mean?" She said I may have mentioned to him, since he asked directly, that the owner would be dining privately in the restaurant on Thanksgiving evening. I said, "Ruth." She said, "You can't stay in the corner forever." I went to Thanksgiving. I wore a good dress. I drove to the restaurant on Millbrook Road, which I had never been to, which my mother and Brandon had chosen because it was new and well-reviewed, and I walked in at 6:15, and I was shown to the table by the hostess, who directed me not to the long table in the back where my family was already seated but to a smaller table near the side wall. A table with a leaf print paper runner, and 4 booster seats stacked in the corner. I looked at the table. I looked at the hostess. She looked at the seating card, my name, in my mother's careful handwriting, and said, "Your family made a specific request." A specific request. My mother had called ahead to request the seating. I sat down. Eli arrived shortly after, then Cora, then the twins. Eli offered me some of his bread. I accepted. We were getting along fine. I want to be honest with you about those 2 hours at the children's table. I have thought about them often in the months since, trying to determine what I felt, and the answer is not what I expected it to be. I was not humiliated. I was clear. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Humiliation requires that you believe the judgment being made about you is accurate. I no longer believed that. I had not believed it in some years, but that evening, in that room, the clarity was very specific. I was sitting at a children's table, on a paper runner, between a 7-year-old doing a word search and a 4-year-old who had knocked over her apple juice, because my mother had called ahead and made a specific request. And I was, at that precise moment, the person in the room who most understood how a restaurant worked. I knew the table turn time and the cover count. I could see, from where I sat, that the expediting was slightly slow and had probably been slow all night. I understood the food and the room and the economics of the evening in a way that nobody at the long table, ordering their holiday dinners with their cloth napkins, was aware of. That knowledge was quiet, private, and entirely sufficient. I did not need anyone to know it yet. It was enough that I knew. I helped Cora with her soup spoon. Eli showed me 3 of his word search answers, which were correct and which he had found without cheating. The twins performed a small argument about who had more cranberry sauce, and I mediated it with the impartiality of a woman who runs 14 service covers a night and has long since learned that the goal in a dispute is not winning, it is resuming. Eli, who had apparently decided I was worth talking to, asked me what I did for work. I told him I was a chef. He said, "Do you work at this restaurant?" I said no, another one. He said, "Is it better than this one?" I said I thought so. He nodded, satisfied, and returned to his word search. He was 7 years old, and he had asked me the exact right question. I want to tell you what was happening at the adult table, because I could hear parts of it from where I was sitting, and the parts I heard formed a particular picture. My mother was telling the story of Brandon's firm, how well the commercial division was doing, the new project in Columbus, the office building, the square footage. Brandon accepted this the way he always accepted it, with the ease of a man who has never had to work for the attention being given him, which is different from not deserving it. He is not a bad person, my brother. He is simply a person who was always made to feel that his existence was inherently impressive, and who never had reason to examine whether that impression was accurate. His wife, Carla, was describing their kitchen renovation. My aunt and uncle were nodding. My father was eating. My mother was orchestrating, glancing around the table at intervals to confirm that everything was proceeding according to her mental image of a successful family dinner. She glanced at the children's table once, caught my eye for a half-second, and looked away. There was a quality in that glance I recognized. Not guilt, exactly. The particular expression of someone who has arranged something and is monitoring it to make sure the arrangement holds. The look of a person who believes they have placed everything correctly in the room and would prefer that the placement not be questioned. I looked back at my bread. I helped Cora find her napkin. At 7:30, the dining room had filled up to its Thanksgiving capacity. I could see from my small table that it was going well, tables steady, the kitchen rhythm audible through the service door, the room having that particular warmth that comes when the food is good and the service is confident, and the space is doing what a good dining room does, which is make people feel held. I was watching the room the way I always watch rooms, occupational habit, the assessment of how a space is functioning, when I saw him come in. Calvin Marsh. He was in his 50s, jacket over a flannel shirt, press credential lanyard under the jacket that he had clearly forgotten to take off. He spoke to the host's stand, looked around the room, and then began moving in the direction of the children's table with the purposeful stride of a man who has been told where to find the person he is looking for. He stopped at the edge of my table. Eli looked up from his word search. Cora looked up from her cranberry sauce. The twins paused their ongoing negotiation. Calvin Marsh looked at me and said, "I'm looking for the owner of Sycamore. I was told I might find her here." He paused. "Are you Nora Delacroix?" The dining room was not silent. It was a full restaurant on Thanksgiving, with conversation at every table and music at a discreet volume and the sounds of a kitchen working. But the table nearest us, a couple on a date, quiet people, had stopped talking. And the adjacent table, closer to the wall, had registered the small pause of people who have overheard something and are deciding whether to look. I said, "Yes." He said, "I've been trying to interview you since April. I've eaten at Sycamore 4 times. I've written about it 3. I want to write the full story if you're willing." He paused again. I called the conserve transcendent. I stand by that. I said I appreciated it. I said this was probably not the best moment for an interview. He said he understood and handed me his card and said whenever I was ready, he would be. He thanked me and turned to go. And from 8 feet away, at the long table in the back of the room, my mother said, "Nora." She said it the way you say a name when the ground has moved without your permission. I looked at her. I looked at my father, who was holding a bread roll and had stopped mid-reach. At Brandon, whose face had done a calculation that I could see finishing in real time. At Carla, who was looking between me and Calvin Marsh with the expression of a woman putting together a puzzle she had not been told she was solving. The room waited. I said, "Sycamore is a restaurant I own in Dunmore. We opened in March. It's been a good first year." I said it the way you state a fact, clearly at normal volume without performance. My mother said, "You own a restaurant." I said, "Yes." She said, "Since March." I said, "We opened March 9th. There was a silence at the long table. Eli, beside me, looked up from his word search and said, with the perfect neutrality of a 7-year-old who has processed the important information, "Is it a good restaurant?" I said, "I try very hard to make it one." He nodded. He went back to his word search. Cora offered me some of her cranberry sauce. I accepted. What happened next did not happen all at once, and I want to be accurate about the shape of it because I have spent a lot of time in the months since understanding it. My mother left the long table approximately 10 minutes after Calvin Marsh walked away. She went through the hall toward the restrooms. I got up from the children's table. Eli was perfectly capable of supervising the situation for 3 minutes, and he had just found the word serendipity, which was more than enough to occupy him, and I followed her. I found her in the coat room, not the restroom. She was standing with her good coat over her arm and her purse on her shoulder, and the expression of a woman who had come to compose herself and was not finished composing. She looked at me. She said, "You've been building a restaurant, and you didn't tell us." I said, "Yes." She said, "For 6 years." I said, "The building part started seriously about 3 years ago. The saving and planning started before that." She said, "Nora." She said it differently than she had said it in the dining room. Something underneath it was cracking. She said, "I didn't know what you were building." I stood in the coat room of a restaurant I did not own, and I looked at my mother, who is not a cruel woman and is not a bad mother in any simple sense, but who had, over the course of my adult life, assembled a picture of me that was missing most of the important information. I thought about what I wanted to say, and I said it carefully, because carefulness is the thing I have always brought to difficult things. I said, "I know you didn't. I stopped telling you things because telling you things wasn't useful. I don't think you did that on purpose. I think you got used to a version of me that was smaller than what was actually there, and I let you." She was quiet. I said, "The seat tonight, the children's table, that was your picture of me, Mom, not me." Her jaw tightened. "One breath, too," she said, "I did that before I knew." I said, "You've been doing it for years. Thanksgiving for 3 years running, the dinner at Aunt Carol's, the questions about whether I was sure, the at least it's steady. All of it before tonight, and all of it based on a picture that wasn't accurate." She stood with that. She did not argue it. which was the most honest thing she did all evening. I watched her face do the work of receiving that. She is not a woman who takes correction easily. She has never been that woman, and I did not expect her to become one on a Thanksgiving evening in a coat room at a restaurant she had picked without knowing. But she was trying, I could see her trying. She said quietly, "I should have paid better attention." That was close. That was the closest she has ever come to saying the real thing. She put on her coat. She straightened the collar with both hands, the small physical adjustment of a woman restoring herself after something difficult. She walked back into the dining room, not an apology, not an arrival, a step, small and late and real. I received it as a step. I went back to the children's table. Eli had found 3 more words while I was gone. I told him that was excellent. He said, "I know." He went back to looking for the next one. I sat with him until the table was cleared and the children were collected by their parents. I was the last one at the small table. I looked at the leaf print paper runner and the empty booster seats and the bread basket that we had cleaned out entirely, Eli and I, between us, over the course of the evening. Then I got my coat and I walked through the dining room to the exit, and on my way I passed the long table and my mother reached out and touched my hand briefly as I went by. Just for a moment. Just to register that I was there. I kept walking. But I felt it. Brandon found me at the coach room 15 minutes later, when I was getting ready to leave. His face had shed the easy confidence it usually wore, the way a person's face does when they have been thinking hard about something they have not thought about before. He said, "Sycamore, I've heard of it." I said, "Most people in Dunmore have." He said, "I didn't know it was yours." I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Think about the last 10 times we talked about my work, Brandon. What did you say?" He thought about it. I watched him think, which he did honestly, without deflecting or qualifying. I appreciated that. It takes a particular kind of self-honesty to look back at your own behavior clearly, and Brandon was making the effort, which was not nothing. He said, "I said it was good that you were good at cooking." I said, "Right." He said he stopped. That wasn't. I said it was fine, but it didn't invite anything more, and I stopped offering more. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I never thought about what you might be building." I thought about what you were doing. The chef thing, I thought of it as a job. I said, "And Brandon's commercial real estate is." He said, "A career, I see it." He said it without defensiveness, which meant he had already been thinking this exact thought before he walked up to me. I said, "There was nothing you could have said that would have stopped me from building it. I want you to understand that. I wasn't waiting for your support to proceed. I'm telling you this so you understand why I didn't tell you, not so you feel bad about the reason." He nodded. He said, "I want to hear more." I said, "Okay, that's where we start." That conversation, short as it was, is the first honest one I have had with my brother about work in a decade. We are not close in the way of siblings who have built something over years. We are close in the way of 2 people who have decided to try, which is a different thing and also a real thing, and also where most closeness actually comes from, if you trace it back. Brandon came to Sycamore for the first time in February with Carla. They ordered the full menu and stayed 2.5 hours, and he asked questions about every dish that were specific and interested rather than polite. He texted me afterward. He said, "The lamb was the best thing I've eaten in a year. I didn't know you could do that." I texted back, "I've been able to do that for a long time." He sent one word, "Fair." That was the start of something real. My father called me the Sunday after Thanksgiving. He is not a man who calls often or easily, and when he does, the calls are brief and factual in the way of a man who loves people and does not have a large vocabulary for it. He said he had looked up Sycamore's menu online. He said the rabbit ragu sounded good. He said he was proud of me. Then he said, "How much did it cost to start?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did that yourself." I said, "Yes." He said, "Good." That was it, 3 words, good. I held them for a long time because my father is not a man who uses words carelessly, and good from him means something specific and meant. He has been to Sycamore 4 times since November. He always orders the ragu. He always leaves a tip that is larger than the bill warrants, quietly, without making anything of it. He never stays long, but he keeps coming back, and in my family, coming back is the thing that counts. That is what I have decided to believe. It is the most useful thing available, and it is also, I think, true. Here is what the year after Thanksgiving has looked like. So you understand what I'm telling you is real, and not only one evening. Calvin Marsh's piece ran in January, a long feature in the Sunday Columbus paper with a photograph of the entryway and the framed recipe card, and a direct quote from Ruth Alderman, which she gave him gladly, and which ended with something I did not know she was going to say. I watched Nora build this for 6 years and never once asked anyone's permission. That's the rarest thing. Most people wait to be told they're allowed. She just built it. I read the piece in the restaurant before service, alone, sitting at table 6. I read it twice. I did not expect to feel the things I felt reading it, which were pride and something quieter underneath it, the specific texture of being seen accurately in public for the first time. I called Ruth when I finished. She answered on the second ring. I said you could have warned me. She said, you didn't need a warning, you needed a record. The week the piece ran, we were fully booked for 17 consecutive days. I hired a second sous chef. I had to turn away tables I didn't want to turn away, which is a problem I had prepared for financially and not emotionally, and which required me to sit with the discomfort of success the same way I had sat with the discomfort of the children's table. Quietly, fully, without making it smaller than it was. Success is its own kind of thing to learn to carry. I had practiced carrying difficulty for 6 years, and had gotten quite good at it. Carrying the other thing took a different set of skills, and I was a beginner at it, and I had to be patient with myself, the way I was patient with the dining room floor, because some things cannot be rushed without becoming something worse. Ruth came to dinner twice in January. She sat at table 6 both times, because she said it had the best angle on the kitchen door, and she liked watching the expedited tickets come through. She ate the cranberry conserve both times, which is a preservation we do small batch in November with fruit from 2 farms outside Dunmore, the recipe modified from hers over 3 years of iteration. She said the second version was better than the original. I told her I didn't believe her. She said, I know, that's why I said it. And she smiled in the way of a woman who has been watching someone become who they were going to be and is glad she had a good view. Ruth is 68 now. She has opinions about my menu that she delivers without ceremony, and which I receive without offense, because they are almost always right, and because the relationship between a person who taught you and the person who learned is one of the most honest ones available to us if we are willing to maintain it across the years. She is not my mother by blood. She is the person who looked at what I was building and said, I see this, and you won't disappoint me. That is the family I built. Out of a seller-financed agreement and a framed recipe card and a tree that grows in difficult soil. Out of 32 years of Ruth's experience handed over honestly, and a sous chef who said I'm in before I finished the sentence, and a loan officer who believed in independent food businesses, and 6 years of work done in the dark before anyone was watching. The watching came after. The family came after. The table was already mine. This is what I know now, in the March of the second year of Sycamore, sitting in my restaurant before service on a Tuesday when the light comes through the front windows at a particular angle that makes the whole room look like something I built carefully and on purpose. Because I did. I built it in the years my family spent not inviting me to Thanksgiving. I built it in the hours after the hotel restaurant closed, and I was doing the catering company work, and the finance class and the business plan drafts. I built it in the silence I created around the project, which I created not out of secrecy, but out of the specific understanding that certain things can only grow when you stop waiting for permission and approval and start simply doing the work. I had help. That is important to say clearly. Ruth gave me the building and the truth, and the expectation of competence that I had not received anywhere else in those years. The SBA loan officer, who approved my application, a woman named Diane who said she believed in independent food businesses and meant it. My sous chef Marcus, who has worked with me since the hotel restaurant and who I called first when I finally told someone about Sycamore 2 years before opening in the parking lot of a grocery store at 10 at night, and who said, "I'm in," before I finished the sentence. I am not self-made in the way that phrase usually gets deployed, which is to say, without anyone. I am self-made in the way that matters, which is to say, I made the choices, I took the risk, I did the work, I earned the thing. Here is what I have learned about legibility, the organizing principle of the family I grew up in. I used to believe the problem was mine, that I was doing work that was too hard to explain, too long to develop, too complicated to fit into a sentence at a dinner party. I believed for years that the silence around my choices was something I had created by being too private, too internal, too much the kind of person who disappears into a project and emerges only when it is finished. That is partly true. I was private. I did disappear. I did not offer information that was not asked for, and in my family, the questions were not asked. But here is the other part. Some things take the time they take to become the thing they are supposed to be. Sycamore could not have existed at 25. Not because I lacked the talent, I had the talent, but because I lacked the knowledge, the capital, the relationships, the 3 drafts of the business plan, the 8 months of renovation, the 2 jobs and the finance class and the 60 restaurants visited in 60 miles. You cannot be legible before you are finished, and the things that matter are rarely finished quickly. The people who need you to be legible before you are finished will always find you insufficient. That is about them, not about the work. I am finished enough now to be legible, and the room has found out. And on a Thanksgiving evening at a restaurant on Millbrook Road, when a man crossed a dining room to find me, he found me at a table with a 7-year-old doing a word search and a 4-year-old who had spilled her apple juice, and I was completely at ease, because I knew what I had built, even if no one else in the room did yet. That is the thing about doing the work quietly and over a long time. You do not need anyone else's table. You have your own. My mother called the first Monday of December, 3 days after Thanksgiving. She called in the morning, before work, which was unusual. She said she wanted to come see the restaurant. She said she thought she owed me that. She said it plainly, without qualifying it into something smaller, which was an effort I could recognize. I said she was welcome any time. I meant it. She came on a Wednesday in December alone. She wore her good coat and she arrived on time and she sat at table 8, which is in the corner near the window, and she ordered the seasonal menu, the full progression, without asking me to change anything or modify anything or make it easier for her. She ate everything. She asked the server about the sourcing on the parsnips, genuinely asked, wrote down the name of the farm. She tipped 30%. She sat for 2 hours. I did not come out of the kitchen. I watched from the pass, through the small window above the expediting shelf, the way I always watch a service I care about. She was not performing for me. She was eating my food in my restaurant alone on a Wednesday because she had decided she needed to know what it was. She looked at the room the way a person looks at a room when they are trying to understand it. She looked at the other diners, at the service, at the servers moving through the tables. She was paying attention for the first time to what I had built. I am glad she paid attention. I will not pretend otherwise. It mattered, even late. When she left, she stopped in the entryway. She stood and read the framed recipe card, the one with Ruth's handwriting and the words I had written below it. She stood there for longer than you stand to read something that short. Then she put on her coat and she left. She called me from the car. She said, "The duck was very good." I said thank you. She said, "You built something real, Nora." I said I had tried to. I had been trying for 6 years and this was what trying, sustained and quiet and unwitnessed, looked like when it finished. She said, "You didn't need us to know." I said no. There was a pause, she said, "But I'm glad I know now." That is not a full accounting. It is not the apology I might have wanted at 25 or 28 or 31. It is what she was capable of in that December parking lot, and I received it as what it was, a real thing, partial and late, and worth having anyway. I have not been sat at the children's table since. This past Thanksgiving, my mother made the reservation at Sycamore. She asked for table 6 because I had told her about Ruth and she wanted to sit where Ruth sits. I gave her table 6. My father came. Brandon came with Carla. The cousins came, the whole assembled group that had gathered for 3 Thanksgivings without me, now seated in a room I had built in the years they were gathering. I made sure the kitchen sent out something extra, not because they needed it, but because that is what I do for the people who matter, and they are people who matter, complicated and late and mine. Ruth came too. I had asked her. She arrived early and sat at her table and watched the service with the quiet satisfaction of a woman watching something she helped make, which is the correct way to watch it. My mother introduced herself to Ruth before dinner. I was not there for the conversation and I did not ask about it afterward. Some things do not need to be reported. The fact that it happened is enough. Eli came. He sat at the regular table this time. He ordered the cranberry conserve with his entree and ate it with the same focused appreciation he'd given his word search, and then he looked up and said, "This is very good, Aunt Nora." I said, "Thank you, Eli." He said, "Do you make it yourself?" I said, "From a recipe a friend taught me. The best people usually give you something to keep." He thought about that with the serious attention of a 7-year-old who had decided to take the conversation seriously. He said, "I'm going to learn to cook." I said, "Good, come see me in the kitchen when you're older, I'll teach you." He said, "Okay." He went back to his food with the settled confidence of a child who has made a plan and intends to keep it. I went back to the kitchen, which is where I belong, where I have always belonged, where I built the table that was worth sitting at. I looked through the expediting window at the dining room. My family at table 6, the full set of them, eating the food I made in the room I built from a plan I made in the years they spent not looking. That was the view. That is still the view. It is enough. That's my story. One seat at a children's table, one man who crossed a room to find me, and a restaurant built in the years my family spent looking the other way. If you've been building something quietly, keep building. The room finds out eventually. If someone gave you a recipe card, a seller-financed building, "You won't disappoint me," go thank them today. That kind of giving is rare and it deserves to be named out loud. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who's still in the building years and needs to know it's worth it. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.